Good evening and welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Tracy, Shilshi, and today we're taking a closer look at the government versus NGO tussle. In the second round of crackdown on NGOs, the centre has cancelled the licence of 4,470 such setups. The government's efforts to regulate NGO operations has also hit top universities in the country this time. The Union Home Ministry cancelled the registration of these NGOs under the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, or the FCRA, after going through their activities. So what's the logic behind these moves? Is there more to what we can see? What impact will we see of this in the future? To discuss this, we have on our panel this evening Professor Madhav Nalapat, who's from Manipal University. We've got Professor Anand Kumar of JNU and Nitin Sethi, who's the Associate Editor of the Business Standard, with us here on the panel. And also, we've got Biraj Patnaik, who's the Principal Advisor of the Office of the Supreme Court Commissioners, joining us from the capital as well. If I could come to you first, Professor Kumar, the government's reason, one of the main reasons for it, for this strong action, that non-filing of annual returns by these NGOs, is that justified?
You know, it takes a long time to create an institution, and that too on voluntary initiatives. Much longer time to get FCRA sanctioned by the bureaucrats sitting in this and that office. And with a stroke of pen, you destroy their credibility, you withdraw their permit, and you make them dance and sing according to your tunes. This is not at all expected from a genuinely democratic government. They could have sent a few reminders. They could have asked for certain other ways
They do claim that the Home Ministry actually sent some notices.
We'll have to check that.
Yes.
You know, if you ask JNU, and declared Delhi University and National Law University as among the defaulters, there is something wrong in your methodology. It's more madness than any method. Maybe there is some method in this madness. I think there is some fear about international linkages with voluntary action in the country. Civil society is not being appreciated by the present regime. They don't realize that voluntary societies are the lifeline for expansion of democratic spaces. It's not us. All over the world, you attack civil society, you are actually hurting yourself if you're a Democrat. If you're not a Democrat, go ahead, destroy whatever has been created in last 66, 65 years. Previous governments were not casual governments. There was a Vajpayee government. They also wanted to do a bit of streamlining. Streamlining is one thing and destruction is another thing.
All right, Nitin, Home Ministry, not just sources, Home Ministry officials, in fact, have confirmed that this was a move that the UPA too was planning. However, they got cold feet at the last moment and they couldn't do this. Is that something that you are learning as well? Because it seems like it is this particular government who is gunning against all these NGOs.
I think that bit is true. The UPA was also looking at using the provisions of the FCRA in a rather discriminatory fashion. Thankfully, at the last point, perhaps they stepped back a bit. But you must understand the law itself is so obnoxiously discriminatory and full of discretion that it provides the government all avenues to do whatever it wants in only select cases that it wants. It doesn't provide transparency. It doesn't actually say that the civil society will come clean with its actions, which is required. It doesn't, at the other time, also make government responsible for its actions based on that law. So it's a built-in law that creates such a situation that the centre can do almost anything under that act. So perhaps UPA didn't feel so comfortable going ahead and doing all this. But this government seems to have used it as discriminatorily as possible and as selectively as possible. If you look at these particular cases where the FCRA licenses have been cancelled, I'm sure if the government went back as UPA did and checked, half of those institutions didn't exist to begin with. Because under our Registration of Societies Act, organizations once created, you can't shut them down. So a lot of them have propped up somewhere or the other, taken a project or two and then disappeared. And you don't even know. So half of them don't exist. Now, instead of cleaning up that act, saying we'll have a regulatory framework for civil society as good as one for the corporate world and bring them on board, create a new regime. Instead of doing that, if you just use these existing loopholes to create a certain kind of messaging for the society, I think that's a very weird and dangerous path to take.
All right. Professor Nalapat, are there any particular kind of NGOs that are being targeted or that are being profiled? Do you see a trend in that?
You know, I simply want to put the whole thing in a context, and I quite agree with Nitin that we have a colonial system of law which gives a huge discretion to the government. And that kind of a law, frankly, we do need to change to a democratic law, because we have a democratic constitution and colonial laws and a colonial style of administration. There's no doubt about that. Having said that, let me put this in context. In 2011, we saw the so-called Arab Spring. We have seen these color revolutions in Ukraine, for example, and other countries. And we have seen multiple foreign-funded NGOs very active in seeking to change governments through the street rather than through the ballot box. I think it's after that that governments across the world, it's not just India, it's Egypt, it's governments, it's various governments across the globe have been a little sensitive about the influence of foreign entities through NGOs on the system of governance. Now, what has happened in India? Take this Ford Foundation, for example. At one time, the Ford Foundation was funding agricultural projects, education projects, doing excellent work. The Green Revolution, it helped significantly. In education also, it did a lot of very good work. But lately, it's been funding what's called advocacy projects. Projects that talk in terms of dividing Indian society into multiple layers. Projects that talk in terms of empowerment and disempowerment. So it's getting directly involved in very sensitive societal issues. So I think this is the context in which this kind of an action has been taken. Having said that, I'd like to, of course, agree with him that I think this action was too broad-based and it should have been much more narrowly focused. What has happened is by making it so broad-based, you're throwing the entire concept into disrepute. Whereas if we had focused it on a handful of troublemakers, then the 95% of NGOs who are doing good work would have been spared this kind of bad name.
All right. Mr. Patnaik also with us from the capital. Mr. Patnaik, give us a sense really of, NGOs as far as India is concerned. A lot of social projects of the government as well are, facilitated through NGOs. They are a part of, a lot of places where the government can't go through. In rural areas, the NGOs actually take those projects forward. What would you say really of what this eventually means, this crackdown eventually means for NGOs like that, the future of their existence?
No, I think I'm less worried about what will happen to the NGOs. Their organizations, they will raise money locally, they will survive one way or the other. But what worries me is what is it doing to the space of the democratic space in the country for civil society. I'm not arguing, and it is nobody's case that the actions of the Home Ministry are entirely unjust in all these cases. That all the 9,000 they cancelled earlier and 4,700 odd they've cancelled now, that there was no reason to do so. Perhaps there was a good reason. But that is the point. We don't have the names of these organizations. We don't know why they have been cancelled. And when this is being done in the atmosphere of what is happening with Greenpeace or what is happening with Ford Foundation or with other donors, it creates an atmosphere of intimidation and fear. I have a disagreement with Professor Arun Kumar when he says that perhaps this government doesn't realize what these actions will do to the democratic space. On the contrary, I believe that they realize perfectly well what it will do, and this is what they intend to do. By these actions, the Home Ministry is essentially sending a message to NGOs that if you don't fall in line, you're next. And I think that's dangerous for Indian democracy. And I would say that, we need to compare foreign funding of NGOs with, say, foreign funding for companies. On one hand, government goes all out, rolls out the red carpet and does everything it can to facilitate foreign direct investment in companies. You have a separate Ministry of Corporate Affairs which deals with this. Now imagine a situation if they abolish the Ministry of Corporate Affairs and put the Home Ministry in charge of all corporate affairs. That would be completely disastrous because the Home Ministry operates from a punitive framework. And that's exactly what's happened with NGOs, with civil society in India. There is a history to it. This happened, the FCRA itself, as we know, came during the paranoia of the emergency. And the people who were opposed to the emergency and the paranoia of the emergency are in power now. People who were badly affected by the emergency are in power now. And yet, you don't have, even they are unwilling to give the space to civil society because they realize the power of civil society. They have seen civil society act on the anti-corruption movement, which formed a major plank for their electoral success. And they know that civil society has the power to undo them as quickly as they brought them, had a role in bringing them to power. So I think the government is acting in a manner which is unjustified.
I simply want to say that, I think the FCRA, if I recall, was 73 which is a good 2 years before the emergency was enacted. Now,
1976, 1976.
76, I see. Very good. Then exactly during the emergency. I simply want to point out that, look, a lot of these NGOs are now agitating against coal. Now, they are funded by organizations whose top representatives come from Australia and Canada, two major coal-producing countries. Recently, we saw one individual being offloaded and put back on a flight. He was from Australia. Now, Australia is selling enormous quantities of coal to India. Now, you shut down collieries in India. You deprive our people of jobs. You deprive our country of foreign exchange. And your country benefits both jobs and foreign exchange. I think there's something wrong in this. So you have a lot of these NGOs who are blocking power projects. Now, how are we going to increase economic development, increase the income of people without power? So the point is, therefore, there is ample ground to believe that some of the agendas of some of these NGOs are certainly suspicious.
Yes.
I'm not saying all of them. I'm saying 5%. And I fully agree by this kind of an action, by tarring everybody in the same brush.
For one, Greenpeace, I mean, it's not just India, and it's not just countries like China
Tracy,
and Russia. But
one quick response.
Yes.
Okay, and after that I go to Nitin, Sethi. Yes, go ahead.
No, a quick response to what, a very quick response. Now, look, again, it's nobody's case, I don't want to get into the details of coal, but if there was something wrong that these NGOs were doing, then there is a judicial process. Why is it that the high courts have repeatedly overturned the Ministry of Home Affairs interventions and cancellation of NGOs in the case of Greenpeace, which Professor Nalapat is referring to, in the case of INSAF, in the case of People's Watch in Tamil Nadu? Why is it that the courts are overturning everything that the Home Ministry is doing? I mean, if indeed the actions of these NGOs were anti-national, the courts would have taken cognizance of it. Now, the question is that what is it that these organizations are opposing? They are not opposing the ability of India to increase its power capacities. What they are opposing is violation of the rule of law in the areas where this is happening. Now, if you have a disagreement with that, please settle it in court. Actions like offloading people, sending them back. I have examples of people who are working on the right to food who have been offloaded for no reason, academics, all because they attended a meeting in Ahmedabad, which ostensibly the government in Gujarat decided was anti-national. Now, this is the kind of, it projects India in very poor light. You have editorials in every major newspaper against the attitude of the government. It just shows us, shows us up like some kind of a banana republic with no rule of law, where, these are things that happen in Russia, they happen in China. India is proud of its democratic traditions. If we are going to be afraid of a few individuals coming in from here and there, I mean, then we really have to ask ourselves if we are worth it a democracy. If they can come here and disrupt democracy, so to say,
the key
or
word being
stop
afraid,
economic growth,
the key word
there
being
is something fundamentally wrong here.
Is it fear? Is it fear? You were trying to react to what Professor Nalapat was saying.
I think we both end up partly agreeing with each other. So I'll partly agree with him.
Yes.
I also agree with him on the fact that, say, the perspective that Greenpeace takes, I do tend to disagree with their views. I do think some of the positions that they take are perhaps not the positions that I would also like. And I'm very clear that the government, not just this government, if the previous government was disagreeable with that idea of how the Indian economy should go. But let's ask, are they the only ones saying this? Now, till 10 years back, the UPA government said we'll go ahead with coal. Mr. Narendra Modi, as Chief Minister of Gujarat, said, no, we shouldn't go ahead with coal as much. We should build on a huge renewable structure as well. This is something Greenpeace was saying as well. Now, even foreign governments, US, EU and others are now talking about disinvestment in India in coal. Now, there are different points of views. Are they illegal to have different points of views? And that's where you come down and say, is it illegal to think that the Indian economic system should work in a different direction? The view we have on coal now, even we are discussing, and soon we will put up on the table in the UN, discussing by when will our coal production start to ebb, how far do we want to go with coal production. These are views and they change. I mean, for all you know, my ideas that coal should go on for the next 30 years might be completely off the table. I might have been off my knockers saying it. 10 years down the line, you'll have a technology that can shift the things around. Is the view illegal? Is the view different? And that's the difference that the government still somehow doesn't seem to maintain. If it's illegal to have a different view than the government, perhaps they should all go behind bars. Perhaps a lot of journalists will go behind bars as well. So that difference, and again, I completely agree with him. I do believe certain agencies that work here, certain organizations that work here, get sponsorships from these foreign governments to do work on a certain agenda. Are we going to ban all these governments from operating in India? Are we going to push them out? Again, as Biraj was saying, a lot of corporates have interests which are really not inimical to Indian economic interests. Are we going to shunt them out as well?
If I could bring you in as well, that's one of the arguments. You know, a lot of these NGOs are sponsored by, you know, they don't toe the Indian line in a sense, because obviously the Indian government is not giving them money. The foreign funds are, of course, being given from other countries, other governments, in fact. And what stops them from, you know, like we were pointing out about how Ford Foundation was perhaps going into other structures which the Indian government is not comfortable with?
You know, you have a system of law. It's well known that NGO sector, like religious sector,
Patnaik, they're saying no, yes.
Yeah, both of them are used by international political processes, like chessboard system. They use these NGOs to malign the rival country, but that cannot make you so blind about their useful value. These ladies and gentlemen sitting in seats of authority today in Delhi were behind the bars, and Amnesty International was the only agency around the world, I know it for sure because I was one of the activists and I was one of the beneficiaries, who was asking for their whereabouts. And today they are so ungrateful. Greenpeace is talking about 21st century challenges. You may disagree, all right, so do debate. Parliament is there, majority opinion is there. Greenpeace is not having any veto power. Ford Foundation, most of them have a double face. They go and apply to Ford Foundation for the grants, including the left. And when it comes to talk about plain objective facts, they become party to bureaucracy for some strange reasons. So I think this double talk, this hypocrisy must not be allowed. Corporates are also playing foul. They are not doing their job. Will they be banned? There are companies which were not allowed by the previous regimes. Now their cases are being reviewed. So you must have your own sense of judgment. You must separate NGOs from NGOs, voluntary sector from voluntary organizations. But don't be so fast and quick and sure. I think there are 4 areas in which voluntary organizations have created pain for these people in power, particularly the new regime. One is communal harmony. They have been targeted for last 12, 13 years since Godhra and Gujarat. Second is gender issues. After Nirbhaya, we had egg on our face, and rightly so. But they blame the NGO. I mean, you are trying to punish the messenger for the message. Third, of course, is ecology. Our record is totally shameful, from Kedarnath and Badrinath to Vedanta and POSCO. Only Supreme Court has been coming off and on to help us, apart from these voluntary organizations. And fourthly, the issue of poverty. We keep on telling about our figures of growth rate, but the bottom line stories are really sad and very depressing. You are now using FCRA as an excuse. Please come out, be open. Let there be an open debate. What are the areas where voluntary action is allowed? What are the areas where government must monopolize everything?
No, well, actually, it was FERA in 1973, a pretty draconian law, you know, and FEMA came in 1999. I couldn't agree more than with him. I agree with you that we have far too many obstructive laws. The bureaucracy gets too much of power. Those in power get too much of power. And unfortunately, whichever party comes to power, although that party has challenged this kind of situation in opposition, as soon as it comes to power, changes its attitude. And the party which is now in opposition changes its attitude.
Yes.
I mean, the Congress party had 10 years to repeal these laws.
Sure.
They had 10 years to ensure that these provisions were chucked into a dustbin, as I firmly feel they should be. But they did nothing. So the point I'm trying to make quite now, take, for example, the rule of law, which our friend was talking about. The Ford Foundation, to my knowledge, I mean, it is not a legal entity in India. There is no scrap of paper that has been signed by the foundation saying what it is. No permission has been given to it, either under FERA or under FEMA or under FCRO, and it conducts a whole range of activities without any permission whatsoever. It's a different matter. Reserve Bank has connived at it. It's a different matter that the various ministries have connived at it. But the reality is quite often these very powerful organizations believe they're above the law. Take the Ford Foundation. As soon as the government of India put the Ford Foundation on a prior watch list, no less than the State Department of the United States condemns India. The US ambassador goes and does almost a dharna before ministers in Delhi and condemns this. Now, with this kind of power, they are not used to being held accountable. And the reality is, several times they have broken the law. I agree the law should be changed. I agree the law is colonial. But so long as it is there, regrettably, all of us have to follow it. Small people like us and very powerful institutions like Ford.
Ford as well. Mr. Patnaik, would like to come in? One second,
Of
Nitin.
course.
Yes.
Yeah. Look, I don't hold a brief for Ford Foundation and what they do in India. They may have a troubled past, but this is also an organization that funded the Planning Commission when it was being formed. It funded the IIMs, including IIM Ahmedabad. It even currently funds the government of Gujarat. And please remember that every single proposal of theirs is approved by the Department of Economic Affairs. This is even before the recent ban. This has been happening for years. Professor Anand Kumar mentioned amnesty. Let me just remind your viewers that if they went to the parliamentary proceedings in the Janata government immediately after the emergency, Amnesty International was one of the organizations which was hailed in parliament by the then Prime Minister Morarji Desai and other leaders of the opposition for being the institution that had declared the people who were behind bars, including some of the top leaders of the BJP, as prisoners of conscience. Amnesty is not an organization that is funded by any government. It operates on individual donations. So I think one needs to be very circumspect when sort of tarring all international organizations with the same brush. I agree with Professor Nalapat. What we need is a new legislative framework for dealing with NGOs, and what we need is a new regulatory framework for dealing with NGOs. And the Home Ministry, I'm afraid, is completely ill-equipped to take anything than a very punitive view of the work of civil society. They are in no position to judge development work, and they shouldn't be. And on the other hand, I'd also like to say that, maybe this government has an opportunity to use this to clean up the air and to create these framework. What prevents them? The UPA, and Professor Nalapat, I couldn't agree with him more, not only did they not repeal these laws, they made the mandatory re-registration of FCRA compulsory when Mr. Chidambaram was Home Minister. They brought in tougher IT laws for NGOs. So they have done their bit to damage NGOs because they were, of course, extremely uncomfortable with the role that NGOs were playing in exposing what was going on in coal in the Supreme Court. Much of what organizations have been saying are being upheld by the Supreme Court. Should this not give us some room as citizens to sit back and reflect that when the highest courts of our country are upholding what a set of institutions are saying, and the government is now going precisely after those institutions, there is something wrong in the way democracy is being perceived
who demands
by
those
this
regulations? Who eventually is responsible to bring in those regulations? Is it up to the NGOs again?
Of course, it's the central government which is responsible. The civil society, as back as 2010, have proposed changes. They themselves have said, let's bring a transparency regulation which asks us to provide certain information, bring us at par with the corporate world. Right now, if you went and asked any NGO, what are your annual returns, who funds you, you have no details. They don't need to disclose it to average citizen. They perhaps, and a lot of them complain, they send their annual reports to the Home Ministry. The Home Ministry isn't under the law even required to give a receipt saying we've received it. So there's so much lacking. But let me go back to one specific case to suggest how these things operate. Now take the case of Greenpeace, and with the caveat that I completely disagree with Greenpeace's view on the coal issue. They went after Mahan, they looked at Mahan and the illegalities there, while the UPA government was pushing the case of the Mahan coal block, the SR and Hindalco coal block. They were blatant illegalities. Greenpeace, unfortunately I believe, for their larger mandate, they were able to get there. They were able to clearly show there were such large illegalities that even BJP, when it came into power, after all its reluctance, had to cancel. That's one of the few blocks that even BJP couldn't auction out because they knew it was so blatant. And now you've got the SR leaks, which actually purportedly show lots of other key people taking benefits for clearing that project. Now, in this entire gamut, you cannot look at the attack on NGOs in isolation. You have to look at the larger framework in which this government is moving. And that's where it scares the hell out of me. I think that's where we need to fear and decide. Again, as I was saying, is it illegal? Is it just objectionable? Is it something you disagree with? And if a democratic society can't distinguish between these three phrases, I think we need to relearn our languages again.
All right, Nitin, Sethi, I've got at least the panel here and also Mr.
Tracy,
Patnaik.
just 1 second,
Yes.
just 1 second
I'm running
on this.
short of time, just 30 seconds.
Yeah, just 1 second on this.
Yes.
I know, 30 seconds. I mean, look, I think the question that we have to ask is, should the license of SR be cancelled for committing these illegalities, or should the license of the organization that exposed some of these illegalities and brought it to the notice of judiciary be cancelled? So that is the key question that India has to confront, because it's not just about the cancellation of licenses. It's a question of a whole worldview of what development is.
And that's the bigger picture, perhaps, that you've painted out for us there. Thank you so much to all our panelists here. Are NGOs easy targets, perhaps? Is that blanket ban, going to make other smaller NGOs actually suffer while you're trying to target, bigger ones like Ford or Greenpeace? That's a question that, of course, every one of us would be thinking about. Answers still remain to be answered. Of course, the government, of course, has to be looking into all those things. We'll have to see, of course, how the NGOs react. But thank you so much for joining us. And the news continues after this break. Do stay with us.